king. I can do anything.
Shout out to my friend Dennis Carlin, nephew of, you guessed it, Uncle George. Dennis and I have been talking about this subject, exactly what may have happened with Jim Morrison. Earlier this week, we were kind of DMing back and forth on this, and I hope that Dennis takes the opportunity to call in later on. But let's bring in Michael Christopher to get the breakdown of this. Good evening, Michael. How are you?
Ian, it's great to talk to you again. How are you?
Good. You're terrific. So, I know that as a music writer, you follow both current and issues from the past, historical issues like this one. Why is it that you think the story, these loose ends about the death of Jim Morrison, why do you think they never get tied up?
Well, Ian, the first thing I want to do is apologize if I'm a little raspy tonight. I've been working on the narration for my new audiobook.
Oh, cool.
So I think I overdid it a little bit in recent days. Maybe it sounds sexy. Who knows?
Yeah, I think the listeners of your audiobook will say, "Oh, those were the sexy chapters." So
exactly.
Yeah. Who was it? McCartney or Lennon used to smoke before certain tracks just to give him that raspy sound in his voice.
Lennon would do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of cracks me up.
But
all right.
What I think that you really hit the nail on the head with the loose threads. There's just a lot of things that were unanswered. Nobody found out. Today is actually the 50th anniversary of the day that the general public found out that Jim had died. It was 6 days after he had allegedly, supposedly, it depends what you want to feed into, that he had allegedly passed away in Paris. And that was one of the things that led people to think, well, that seems a little fishy. I mean, here's this big star, this big rock and roll star, and we don't find out for almost a week that he died. And also the fact that only 3 people saw his body, his girlfriend, their assistant, and the coroner. And it left a weird taste in a lot of people's mouths. And I think that's why there's been so much mystery and so many stories about it over the years.
All right, so I'm going to play devil's advocate here because I have the great honor of being the executor of a couple of friends' estates in their passing. No great, thing to do except to make sure that the will gets executed, etc. But so I'm a little familiar with how things work in that regard, and I would wonder whether there was just a pure, in a legal sense, they wanted to make sure their ducks were lined up before they made some big announcement. They wanted to make sure that all the T's were crossed, all the I's were dotted on any documents, any type of transference of his accounts to his wife, whether there were any business issues, and so therefore they avoided making a public announcement until they knew that nobody would be jumping up and trying to run to the bank.
That is one line of thought, and I can see your point on it, but I think that it's got to be one of the biggest cover-ups in history for a celebrity of his status to be able to have died and to keep it quiet that long. Now, obviously, it's not like it is today. We have social media, and you find out in minutes if somebody passed away. But the fact that they were able to not only keep his death a secret, but to bury him in a cemetery, especially Père Lachaise in Paris, which is one of the most popular cemeteries in the world, with Oscar Wilde and Chopin buried there.
Sure.
To hide all of that is just it's wondrous to this day even.
Okay, so again, I'm glad you're taking this position, okay, but I'm going to continue to poke at it.
Okay.
What's the difference between hiding and just being private? Why would we not just say, well, Jim Morrison, in the end, he was a recluse. He was kind of a private guy. If he had wanted all of the constant adulation to the very end, he wouldn't have jumped to Paris. He wouldn't have been living in isolation with his wife. Maybe in the end, this was actually what his wishes were, was that he would go quietly should that ever happen, not, you're covering up my death. Like his death was supposed to be some sort of news bomb that went off. Maybe he was just a guy who wanted to slip quietly into that good night.
I wonder if at 27 years old he was really thinking about when he was going to end up dead. I don't think that his passing would have been something that he would have been thinking about, no matter how hard of a partier he was. I don't think he thought that far ahead. He did say that he wanted to be buried in that cemetery, and he wanted to be buried by the poets, and he is in Poets' Corner, but I think that was an almost offhanded remark. I don't think he really meant, I'm going to be dead soon, so let's put me there and let's keep it quiet. I think that the reason why it was kept quiet more than anything was guilt from his girlfriend Pamela, his common law wife, and the fact that it may have been a drug overdose. I mean, she was denying it to. It's not just denying it to the press, which she had done in the days after his passing, but when the Doors manager called her and said, "Look, I'm hearing these rumors about Jim being dead. We know we've heard them before. Can you just calm our minds a little bit?" And she said, "No, he's fine. He's resting. He's exhausted, but he's fine." And the manager kept pushing. Is he dead? Is he still alive? What's going on? Why can't I talk to him? And then she finally said, "All right, he's dead." So I can understand if you want to hide it from the public and you want to have everything kept quiet and private, but why do you hide it from people who are in an official sense, the ones that are he didn't find out until 2 days later, the Doors manager. So why would you try and keep it quiet from him?
Yeah, I guess part of that is it's a great question. I don't think we have enough data to say why. Not that you shouldn't be suspicious. I'm suspicious too. I mean, this parallels to me a lot of the later death of Kurt Cobain. But I also know, just in real life, right? I remember we didn't even have kids yet. My wife and I were married, and we were watching a news story, and there was a tragic story about some child that had died, and they were on TV, and they were interviewing the mother, and the mother was saying, "That was my baby. I can't believe my baby is gone," and went on railing like you would expect somebody to do under those circumstances about the safety of the pool or whatever. And my wife said, "I would never do that. If anything ever happened to our child, you would never know. I would never go on TV." And I said exactly the opposite. I said, "Are you kidding me? If anything ever happened to my kid, I would want the whole world to know about my kid. I would shout it from the highest mountain that the world just lost a potential game changer, a child that could have grown up to become something really special and important." I'm with this mother in her grief. Now, this is just to say that people have different reactions to death and to privacy at that moment. And I just always thought that was compelling because we both would have had the same loss, but experienced it quite differently. And I don't know where her head was. Do we know his common law wife at the time, as portrayed so beautifully? I thought the Doors movie captured the spirit of that.
By Meg Ryan.
By Meg Ryan. Maybe she was just mad at him. Maybe she was just pissed that it was a drug overdose. Maybe she was just like, I can't believe you would die like this, dying so stupid at a time when you were trying to come back.
She was in the throes of heroin addiction herself.
Right.
So I don't think she was thinking with the most clear head either, which could also attribute to why people didn't find out.
Maybe she was hiding drugs. Maybe she was like, it took a couple days for her to get clean before she would talk to the police.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you mentioned being a parent and that track.
Yeah.
The fact that his parents didn't even find out for another week. I mean, they had to be told by the American embassy, and they're like, "Wait, he's dead? Okay, let's get his body back here." Well, no, he's actually already been buried. And they're like, "What?"
Right.
None of this makes any sense to them. So for them, I watched an interview with his sister recently, and she was saying how they were just blown away by, like, how could this possibly happen that no official had given any information. The only information anybody received was from the manager of the Doors. There was no American embassy at first. There was no law enforcement. Nobody was involved. There was just a sealed coffin and the word of the manager of the Doors, and that's it.
Yeah. By the way, that voice is getting pretty, whiskey and cigarettes. I just want to. I find myself strangely attracted to you right now, Mike. Michael
All right.
Christopher. Michael Christopher is a music writer. We're talking about the death of Jim Morrison. We'll do this for a while before we get to open lines, but we'll get to your questions and comments coming up next hour. I know the phones were a little crazy already. All right. So we know also that he was buried in Poets Corner. I've always been curious who gets that honor. Who gets just to say, I want to be buried in Poets Corner? In the most prestigious, if there is such a thing, cemetery in Paris, that's where I want to be buried, and then they are.
It's not just getting buried at your local cemetery.
Right.
You have to go through so much red tape, which is another question. How in the world does an American, known over the world as a rock star, even though he fancied himself a poet, and a lot of people would make the argument that he was a poet first and a rock star later, how do you get into a grave in that cemetery in such a prestigious area? Somebody had to be paid off because it's decided by officials. It's not, you can't just, you don't put in for a raffle. You don't say, oh yeah, you know what, I want to be buried in that cemetery. Can we make the arrangements? And to have it happen so fast, it's just another one of those loose threads you spoke about.
Right.
It's so bizarre. How did that happen so quickly that he gets buried in that cemetery and in Poets Corner?
All right. So this brings me back to why it took 6 days, and is maybe it just all hinged on that. Is that just like you just said, she had to pay off somebody. Money had to be exchanged to the right people to guess. And if she had announced Jim Morrison just died, he wants to be buried in Poets Corner in Paris, the hue and cry from Parisians, from the French about an American, as you say, American rock star quasi-poet, although I think better than that, but okay, is buried next to all of these legendary people. No, we will not allow it. And so instead, it was better to go under the radar, get him in the ground, possession being 9/10 of the law, and get him buried in the cemetery before making the announcement so that they wouldn't disinter him. What do you think?
It's fascinating to me because I wonder what channels they had to go through at the cemetery that nobody leaked anything and said, we got Jim Morrison here. It's listed on his death certificate as poet, but he's an American, and I can't believe that no cemetery officials had leaked that out, that he was being buried there. It's one of those things where behind the scenes there's so much that we don't know, and none of it's been clearly explained. How did that happen? How did he get buried in that cemetery? And there was a bit of an outcry when people found out, but they weren't going to, like you said, they're not going to disinter him because, he's already in the grave. He's already been buried there.
Right.
Although they did try years and years later, decades later. But how does that happen is another one of the mysteries that leads people down those routes of, well, what if that didn't happen? What if it didn't happen? A body in there, and what if something else happened?
Well, all right. So again, Michael Christopher, you're doing great work here. It allows me to really, sort of put on my deerstalker hat and pull out my magnifying glass and play Sherlock on this. So bear with me for a second, because I want to get to the McGowan theories and McGowan's research. I want to get to a lot of stuff, but I specifically on this, maybe again that's part of the point. If Jim Morrison survived, if there were some sort of body double that was being buried, if the coroner was in on it, but the coroner, being a political position in Paris, had the pull, right? He had the juice to get anybody buried in that cemetery under the guise even of Jim Morrison. All the more reason, if it took 6 days, that they had to give the coroner time to get it past the officials. And he said, oh, yeah, that was Jim Morrison, great poet. You know him. And they stick him in the ground at the body double, and Jim Morrison makes his escape, right? I mean, that's another way of looking at the same experiences and going, aha, it would have taken 6 days, whether or not it was a body double or the real Jim Morrison, to get that done.
Yeah, absolutely. Either way, you had to put a coffin in the ground with his name on it.
Yeah.
But you still had to, and which, of course, that's going to take a little bit of time. And behind the scenes, that all the wheeling and dealing that was done, it's so fantastic to me that was never leaked out during that time. I mean,
Right.
you have the coroner, you have the officials at the cemetery, and nobody says anything. It makes me think.
Thank God, though.
Money.
Yeah, but I mean,
change
you know what?
I think.
I'll grant you, but that's a little. You'll understand, and I understand why you are this way in this regard. But that's a little cynical to say that anytime, unless there's massive amounts of money, nobody can keep a secret for the bereaved. I bet you it's not the first secret celebrity that was buried in the cemetery. And I'm also willing to say, because I know a little bit about it, the Doors music was huge in Paris at the time. So maybe it was an honor. But we'll get back to that. Because what if Jim Morrison did escape his death? What if Jim Morrison is not actually buried there? Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. And we're still trying to work out, with the help of Michael Christopher, we're trying to work out exactly what happened around the death of Jim Morrison. Was there a body double? Was there a sleight of hand by Pam in the burial of Jim Morrison in that prestigious Parisian cemetery? Did the real Jim Morrison make his escape? And did he make his escape from her? I'll get back to that next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. So, Michael, you'll like the fact that I put out on Twitter earlier, and we speak on Twitter, we DM on Twitter, but I put out, before anticipating you being on tonight, real quickly, did anybody have any favorite covers of the Doors? And so I snagged a couple of those from @Deacon Punnett on Twitter, and I'll play some of them coming up for bumpers. Some of them I didn't know, which was interesting. Some of them snuck by me. I didn't even know that so-and-so did such and such. But it'll be a good time, even when we get to open lines coming up later on. And we'll give you the phone numbers you need to join the conversation next hour, top of the hour, so that you can explore this with us. So we left off, regardless of whether it's a body double or it's Jim Morrison, it might take 6 days, and 6 days, 3 days, 4 days of privacy to pay off enough people to get, or maybe even if they didn't pay off, just to convince enough people that Jim Morrison was an American poet who died in Paris, who deserved the recognition of being buried amongst the greats. And yet that's kind of where the trail begins for other people. So give me before we talk about Jim being gone, just break down for me, what's the accepted story is that Jim Morrison died in a bathtub, largely of an overdose, right, of a worn-out body from drugs.
Right. The official story is on the night of Friday, July 2nd, 1971, he woke up and told his girlfriend, Pamela Corson, that he wasn't feeling well when he was going to draw a bath. The next morning, in the early morning hours of July 3rd, she supposedly found him reclined in the tub with a bit of blood around his nostrils. She thought he was maybe playing a game with her, but he was actually dead. And his death certificate lists the cause of death as heart failure, but there was no autopsy officially performed.
Right. I don't think that's terribly unusual, except, it seemed like with a celebrity like that, you'd want to know maybe more just to avoid what comes afterward. But there was no violence to the body. There was nothing that showed anything other than, and there didn't appear to be any suicide. It was just a guy who had heart failure while he was in a bathtub, according to that story.
And I think at 27 years old, that's rare to have heart failure, heart attack. True. But what most people don't know is that before he went to Paris, in the months leading up to it, he suffered a 2-story fall at the Chateau Marmont, where the only way he survived was by bouncing off the roof of a shed on his way down.
Yeah.
And the theory was that he may have suffered some sort of internal damage, which didn't show itself until later. It led to the respiratory issues he was having later in France. He had been coughing up blood. So there's a thought that maybe that had something to do with it. It might not have been heart failure. It could have been something to do with a blood clot that went to his heart. We'll never know without an autopsy being performed.
Yeah, you're right. And yet, just looking at the outside of the Jim Morrison story arc, any somebody could do an investigation and determine this is a guy who had done a lifetime of there was a lifetime of drug abuse, and that impacts the heart. We know it happened with Elvis. We know it happens with a lot of other people, where eventually enough of that activity and you can do muscle damage to the heart, which can cause failure or a heart attack or something, which is unpredictable. But that being that's the story. And so they obviously they don't leave him in the bathtub for 6 days. I mean, they come and get him, and he's taken
They actually left him in the bathtub for 2 days. They packed him in ice.
I thought it was just one. Okay.
And put plastic around them. Okay. And then that's when they finally got the coroner to come out there. And then he was taken and put in the coffin.
Okay. So then they take him. The coroner comes and takes him, and that is the beginning of the travel to the cemetery under that story. If that's not true, who was packed in the ice? You think, what's the prevailing theory of what body was there when they came to take him away?
Well, again, there was nobody that saw the body packed in ice other than Pamela, her assistant, and the coroner. So there may have never been a body.
Well, wait, I thought he was taken away by the French ambulance, that they came in. It wasn't just the coroner slung him over his shoulder and carried him out, right?
Right.
Okay, so there would have been somebody saw something because they took the body out on a gurney.
But that's how
I've always read the story.
None of the ambulance people, nobody that was involved in supposedly removing him from the apartment that they were staying in Paris, no one has ever come out and said, "Oh yeah, I remember we had him. He was packed in ice." And not that people are going to go out and say that, "Hey, there was a guy packed in ice, and I want to talk about that." But there's been so much investigating into it over the years that they weren't able to ever find anybody who was involved in removing him from the apartment. Which then leads credence to, what if there wasn't a body double? What if there was, as Ray Manzarek from The Doors had said, 150 pounds worth of sand, bags of sand that they put in the coffin. And it was closed up. When the coffin was closed, they brought it to the cemetery. It felt heavy, felt like a body in there. Right. It could have been Jim, but there was never any body that ever, body double or otherwise.
And so nothing was ever removed from the apartment in this theory. It's just they call, they say, or they get together, they create a conspiracy to get Jim Morrison to leave Paris, but be declared dead at the same time.
Right.
Okay. How do you feel about that theory?
I think that it's a crazy theory.
Okay.
I also think that money talks.
That's
and I
true
think
too.
that if you can pay off the least amount of people as possible, and try to keep it quiet, that something like that possibly could have happened. It wouldn't happen a day like today, I don't think, but back in the early 70s, without the prevalence of the internet, social media, and people just loving the talk, I think that there's a possibility it could have happened.
All right. So the theory is he goes. He wants out. Jim Morrison is tired of living the rock and roll life. And for those of us, as so often happens, when somebody dies young who's larger than life, it's very difficult to accept that they're gone. It seems there's like cognitive dissonance over their disappearance. So let's just assume then that he begins this trek. What is the prevailing theory, regardless of the bodies, regardless of how it was arranged? If Jim Morrison faked his death, and let's put that all in a box called fake death. If he faked his death, where does he go after that? How does he begin to create this new life for himself?
Well, Jim, he'd often talked about faking his death. He wanted to leave the rock and roll lifestyle behind and live under an assumed identity. He told friends that after disappearing, he would reach out under the name Mr. Mojo Rison, which a lot of people recall is what's spoken at the end of L.A. Woman, and is actually an anagram of his full name. As to where he went or where he could have gone, that weekend he was reportedly seen boarding a plane at Orly Airport, which was then the main airport in Paris before Charles de Gaulle. And keyboardist Ray Manzarek, he fanned those flames over the years. I already mentioned how he talked about filling it with the coffin with bags of sand, but he also said, I could see him heading off to Africa. if there was anybody that could have pulled off just getting on a plane, having paid off a French doctor to fill out a certificate, and head off to Africa to live as a poet, to live outside of the spotlight, it would be Jim Morrison.
So, what do we have of his output? If he were to go live the life of a poet somewhere in Africa, are there claims that there are certain works that have made it to the public from that privacy that the poet put out under different names? Do we have any paper trail on his creative output?
No, there have been works uncovered over the years, but it's always been from notebooks that were supposedly pre-existing. It wasn't anything that was found in East Africa, which is one of the places he was supposed to be staying, or India, or anywhere else. There's never been anything uncovered other than in the United States or his journals from Paris.
Okay. There's a reason why I ask, is because I believe that creators create, right? That if we know nothing about the life of Jim Morrison as a rock star, we know that from the very early age, he was creating. He was writing poetry. He was telling stories. He wanted to go to film school. He was a writer first, who happened to surprise everybody with his ability to sing and perform. Although he wasn't, as legend goes, he wasn't a very good performer on live stage. He was very shy, and in that way wasn't a crowd seeker. So it kind of backs up the theory of wanting to go back to being a recluse, but it also challenges me to think, well, creators must create. It's in their very being. I can't go a day without trying to create something, even if it's a dumb tweet. I just feel like it. So that's what I do. And that's what surprises me, that there isn't some body of work somewhere that's attributed to Jim Morrison other than what was in his diaries before his supposed death.
But if he found the spotlight that surrounded him so damning, maybe he didn't want to have that. He was going to write for himself. He didn't want to write and say, okay, I want to have this published, I want to have that published in the advent of my death. He just wanted to write for himself. Such brightness had been shown on him for so many years as a member of the Doors that he wanted to just be that recluse and never have those works published. And that's just, that's one way of thinking about it.
Yeah,
that's why it's not been uncovered. So maybe he did keep writing. He did books and books of poetry that have never come out. Who knows?
Right. Yep. So we're talking again with Michael Christopher, music writer, about the loose ends, the threads that we're pulling on the death of Jim Morrison. And it was 50 years ago. What day is a Monday? Is that, or 50 years ago?
Would have been last Saturday.
Last Saturday. Sorry. It's all a blur for me this week. I can't even remember what date it is today. So, for him to have pulled, there's other rock stars that people have spoken of that said, oh, they faked their death, and Elvis, died in a double wide in Alabama or whatever. But this one is the one that seems like it has the most legs to it. And I think it's because, as you point out, there's a lot of weirdness surrounding his death. What are the most damning or the most elusive aspects about the facts of the case that inspire you to poke at this?
Well, I think that the way that other people have come out over the years and said that that's not how he died, that they say, yeah, he did die, but it wasn't that. It was because of a heroin overdose. Even Marianne Faithfull came out a couple years ago and said that it was her boyfriend that gave him the fatal dose. And then there's the other theories that he was at a Paris nightclub called the Rock and Roll Circus, and he did a line of heroin there, thinking it was coke, and overdosed in the bathroom, and then was brought back to the apartment comatose, laid in the tub face down, just slumped in it. And Pamela found him that way the next morning. Then, of course, you have the more far-out theories that the CIA was involved, which that then falls into the David McGowan stuff.
Yeah. Talk about that, though, because I know that's... And even McGowan himself, David McGowan, the guy who gets credited for espousing much of this online, even he himself doesn't say I have any proof of that. He looks at all of the different elements to that story, and he sees them potentially coming together like Leo. I don't know that I agree with it, but what do you think? I mean, explain the theory that the CIA was involved.
Yeah, so the theory was that the CIA had a hand in creating the whole Laurel Canyon scene, Graham Parsons, Buffalo Springfield, that they had some sort of influence on Frank Zappa. And Jim Morrison was not associated with the Laurel Canyon scene. He, very very loosely, he might have been associated with them. But when it comes to trying to slot him into that, McGowan usually focuses on the fact that Jim's father, George, was a high-ranking official in the Navy. He was an admiral. And if you've got an admiral in the Navy, then the CIA, I'm going by what he said, that the CIA then had a hand in creating the doors because he was an easy mark, being the son of an admiral. And I think that's that theory is, again, a little bit too far out, even for me.
Right. Let's explore another far out theory before we get to the phones, and that is actually the one as far out as this is, to me, seems like one of the most plausible, if it's a given, to the extent that it is true, as we would say in academic writing, that Jim Morrison died in a bathtub. The real Jim Morrison died in a real bathtub. That it was Pamela Courson, his common-law wife, who was responsible for giving him a hot dose of heroin that killed him. And the theory goes that she was his heir as his common-law wife and specified in his will, I guess, as the recipient of everything that he owned. But the reason why the delay happened was not because she was worried about trying to get him in the cemetery in Paris to honor his wishes. That may be a cover for what she was really trying to do, which is talk to her own attorney, who would be required by law to not leak it, and her own attorney making sure that the transference of Jim Morrison's estate to her would go uncontested, or at least would win a contest. It was contested later by Morrison's family, and that's the whole reason for the delay, is that she either gave him a hot dose and killed him on purpose or negligently, and he's dead, and she wants to make sure that she gets the money. Where are you with that?
Right. I mean, Pamela always wanted to be taken care of and always wanted to be around Jim. And they interweave together, but whether it was accidental or she did it on purpose, she gave him that dose because she didn't want him to leave her. And he apparently was making overtures that he was going to leave her. He was going to go back to the States. There was another woman that he was involved with in the States, and she decided, well, if I'm going to be taking care of him, it's going to be when he's dead, and I'm going to inherit all of his money. The other one is, again, if she did give him an accidental overdose or a dose of heroin, a hot dose, then perhaps she realized, he's dead, I'm all alone, I again need to be taken care of. And that's when you bring in the attorney and things have to get ironed out before they can announce anything. So maybe she doesn't tell the manager, she doesn't want to tell any reporters because she's still trying to, cross her proverbial T's and dot her I's.
That's the theory that I believe in. I mean, I really do. And I think she'd been cheated on enough in life. She wasn't going to be cheated on in death. And she had seen him be unfaithful to him with her own eyes. And this time she was going to make sure that she got hers. And then, of course, she dies shortly thereafter. We'll get to that. And your calls, we'll give you the numbers next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Talking with Michael Christopher, and Michael, what's your favorite cover of a Doors tune? Do you have one?
There's a lot of great ones out there. You might know the band The Cult. They did a version of Wild Child, which is on the Stones Immaculate tribute album, which came out, I think, in the early 2000s, and that's a great cover. And Ian Astbury from The Cult ended up singing with the Doors in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Well, back when the other voices right? Of the Doors, that famous album, which is so controversial, the one that came out after Jim Morrison's death.
Well, yeah, that one
without Jim Morrison.
Yeah, with Ray Manzarek singing on that one. That was I don't think that was the wisest move to put that out under the Doors name.
Yeah, I think that was they should have called it the Other Doors and just not
right. Exactly.
Right. So again, we're talking about what would have happened with Jim Morrison. The operating theory being that if he had died, why would there have been the mystery around his death? If he didn't die, then maybe, he went on to live a long, happy life. And there's lots of people that have had Jim Morrison sightings. Let me ask you, what do you think is the most credible Jim Morrison sighting? Is there anybody that knew him that claims to have seen him later in life?
There's been so many people over the years that have claimed to be him. There was a guy who runs a ranch in Oregon. There's a drunk poet in New York City, but that seems more like wishful thinking than anything else. As far as people that are close to him or were close to him, I don't think that there's ever been anything credible other than, and this is an odd one, Ray Manzarek put out a book in 2002 called The Poet in Exile, and it was a fiction book, supposedly, about a keyboardist in a band named Roy, not Ray, and a singer known only by the letter J. And Jay decided to leave the life of a rock star, disappear, go to Africa, fake his death, and he was sending Roy postcards from East Africa for the rest of his life, telling him how things were going. That's the closest you would ever get to someone that was that was a friend of Mars and would say they were still in touch with him.
Right. And again, it comes back down to the mystery around Pam Corson and how she dealt with his estate. If it's true, as I would argue, that she was the reason that the announcement was delayed was so that she could line everything up legally, so that she was as bulletproof as she could be to get his estate when he died, and didn't want to make the announcement until her lawyer gave her the thumbs up. Okay, this is as good as it's going to get. Let's go. We have all the docs we need. There was still a 2-year fight to get, her hands on all of that money. She gets it, and then she too dies of a heroin overdose. And ironically, her parents, with whom I guess she was never really later in life, hadn't really been close to anyway, they inherit all of the Jim Morrison estate.
Right. Yeah, she was dead in 1974, and then her parents get that windfall of money from which then led to another protracted battle with the family of Jim Morrison, of course.
Yeah, but did they win in the end? I thought Pam Corson's family won in the end on that too. They
did win it, but the family got the rights to a lot of his poetry, and they did get some sort of settlement out of it, I believe.
Okay. But there you go. Anytime we're talking about lawyers, guns, and money, eventually it comes back to even the people that might have publicly presented themselves as part of a hippie culture, and can't we all just get along? Push comes to shove, everybody wants the dough. I think so. Let's go to Philip in Raleigh, North Carolina, for music writer Michael Christopher on the 50th anniversary plus 1 week of Jim Morrison's death. Philip?
Yes, Ian, you're doing a great job. Thank you.
I always have fun
in the show. I have been to the grave site. I did not realize it was such exclusive real estate, but being in Paris, I guess that's self-explanatory.
Right.
Actually, the reason I was there because there is a General de Polignac who was a Frenchman who fought as a general in the Confederate Army and was buried in Paris. And while we were having a ceremony at his graveside, I was told Jim Morrison's buried here. And so we went there, and I just wondered, what is the problem with this dude? Why didn't they fly his body back to the U.S.? I mean, I lived overseas for a long time, and I've seen a lot of folks, boxed up and flown back. So it's just really an oddball thing for him.
Well,
that's it, in Paris.
Interesting thought on that. I think the core of your question is why. I think there's generally an answer, but Michael, Christopher, what would you say? Why wouldn't he be buried? Why wouldn't they have flown him back to the United States to be buried at one of the places where he grew up or something?
Well, one of the problems with that is once he's in the ground, he's basically, for lack of a better word, the property of France.
Right.
And once you put somebody in the ground, it's almost impossible to get them out. Over the years, there have been attempts to have him exhumed and brought back to Florida. There was, I think it was 2010, I want to say, 2011, there was a politician in Florida who wanted to exhume him and bring him back to Florida. And at that point, he's been there way too long. And I think as much as they say that they don't like it, there's such a steady run of tourists that come to the cemetery to see the grave that helps the economy, believe it or not. It's one of the most visited landmarks in Paris that they really don't. Paris doesn't want to lose that.
And they've cordoned him off even. You can't even get close to the grave now, I understand it.
You can't. They had to put gating around it, and they have 24-hour security because it was just getting vandalized too much. They had a gorgeous headstone stolen it was a bust of Jim Morrison, and that was stolen several years after he died. They tried to do another one. That one was stolen as well. So now there's just a plaque that was actually commissioned by his parents, and people can go and visit. Some people, they'll drink a little bit, but
yeah, that's what I heard, that they got tired of people pouring alcohol, because he was obviously a big drinker too.
Yeah,
and they got tired of people pouring alcohol on the gravesite. That was the complaint I heard. All right, Susan, Greensboro, North Carolina, on Coast to Coast AM. Sue?
Yes, hello. My question is, do you think that as far as I remember Jim Morrison, I bought a lot of his records many years ago.
Sure.
Really loved him, and I was wondering if you can draw like an analogy or comparison to the death of Jimi Hendrix. Was there ever a cause of death announced with him, and where was he buried?
Well, that was some really good questions, including the hot dose comparison there too. But Michael, I'll let you take that one.
Well, I think that when we were talking about David McGowan, there was correlation drawn between the death of Jimi Hendrix and the death of Janis Joplin, and how maybe the CIA, which had created all these musicians, had something to do with their death as well. And even unrelated to the David McGowan theory is that potentially the CIA wanted to stop having these guys influence the youth culture in the United States, which is why they got rid of Morrison, which is why they got rid of Joplin. And there were certain times when Morrison would be drinking and saying, "You're drinking with number three of the 27 club," which are the people that died. Died when they were 27. As far as the death of Jimi Hendrix, it's always been a little mysterious. It's another one of those accidental deaths of misadventure. But he's buried in Washington, which he's originally from Seattle, and he ended up being buried near where he was born.
And I think that was a truer connection. He had, I think, a truer connection to Seattle than Jim Morrison might have had to any one place, because he was an Army brat or Air Force brat, wasn't he?
Right, he was an Air Force brat or a Navy brat. He grew up in Florida, moved out to California, was there for a while. Whereas Hendrix, even though he died in London, there wasn't a problem with getting his body back to Seattle. He still had a connection there. He still was close with his family, especially his father, Al. And that's where their cases diverge, because Hendrix was slightly less suspicious, although there were, of course, those theories that float around out there that the FBI or the CIA might have had something to do with it.
Well, and I would argue that it isn't necessarily even... there's another argument that could be made that Hendrix was nixed, that he was knocked off because of a management issue, and that he was worth more dead than he was alive, right? Because he was chewing up so much money in these studio sessions, and that it was costing them a lot, but his library was very valuable. And so it was a matter of just, if we got rid of this guy, he's just giving us headaches, and look at all the money we would inherit to work with.
And look at the money that's come over the years. The Hendrix catalog is still one of the most valuable ones out there for legacy material.
Right. We're talking with Michael Christopher, who's currently on the road in a Harvey Fierstein tribute one-man show. So the voice. Brian is in San Diego on a wildcard line on Coast to Coast AM. Brian?
Hi, Ian. Hi, Mike. How you doing?
Hey, great.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Mike, does he know a guy named Grant Jacobs?
Grant Jacobs, no, that doesn't sound familiar. Who's that?
He had Morrison's last writings for the longest time, and he finally sold them for a lot of money. I was friends with him once. I also ran into Ray Manzarek and met him and shared some information with him. But, you were talking about how
did he happen to have the last writings? You got to explain that. How did he have the last writings? I'm all for it. I'm not saying it's not true, but how did it come into his possession, the last writings of Jim Morrison?
Well, there was something about things buried underneath the floorboards of some house, and it got transferred in hands, and he ended up with it. He ended up selling it eventually. But the very last thing Jim Morrison ever wrote was up in a jet airliner, and he looked down on the world, and he lamented how everything is controlled by money, and what a waste of human potential that fact is. That was the last thing he ever wrote. But, Jim Morrison, he is the only person that intimidated John Lennon. John Lennon would not share the stage with Jim Morrison because he was a monster of a talent, and John Lennon knew it. And you were talking about how the CIA and his admiral father with the Navy, that it was the CIA plot. No. In my opinion, because his father was part of the state and the military, Jim becoming a rock star had everything to do with rebelling against that. He was the quintessential rebellion against the police state. And that is why I think the government killed him. In fact, did you know that John Lennon was killed on Jim Morrison's birthday, for example?
All right, let's get Michael in here. Michael?
Yeah, that's fascinating coincidences or not. But he definitely did rebel against his father being a straight-laced military man. His father was at first proud that Jim was going to college. He expressed interest he went to school in Florida, then later he went to UCLA.
In California.
And when Jim called him one day and said, hey, I'm singing for a rock and roll band now, his dad was out of his mind over it. He couldn't believe that he would give up this education, try to start this rock and roll band. How crazy was that? Jim, of course, stuck with it, was making some money, but even then his father thought he's not that great of a talent compared to the other talents that he has as a singer or as a filmmaker or whatever other avenues that his father thought he should pursue. So, of course, there was a lot of disparity between what the father wants and what the son wants, which isn't too out there. It's not too far of a reach for a lot of people. And
I used to be very clearly, I would have been like, yeah, up yours, Dad. And then after I was a father of two boys, I started thinking, well, I put a lot of money in this education thing. Let's move the needle on that a little bit more before you start a rock band. So, yeah, my sympathies switched on that one. But I understand. Or at least I was more understanding. Matt's in Bellingham, Washington on Coast to Coast AM for Michael Christopher. Go ahead, Matt.
Hey, good evening. So a good friend of mine that I went to college with wrote a book called The Language of the Land. He lived with a tribe in Africa. And when he was down there, he would go 6 months out of the year to Africa and 6 months in New York City. And he said there was a guy that ran a bar who said it was an absolute 100% no doubt that Morrison did come down there and became a trader. And he followed in the footsteps of Rimbaud the poet, which was his big inspiration,
right?
And who was from France. And I was just wondering if your guest could talk a little bit about Rimbaud and how that inspired him, and then just to give my piece about what this guy said. There was absolutely no doubt. They knew it. They never said his name to him, but they all knew, those that were there, that it was him. And he went by a different name, and he was a trader now.
Oh, trader in what, by the way?
in like art, antiques and art
Okay.
of
Sure.
the tribes and beads and things like that.
And you're talking about the author Arthur Rimbaud and a poet, a very better known in death, like so many poets. It's almost like it's almost like a job requirement that you should die broke, penniless, diseased, whatever, and then become famous after you're dead. He wasn't quite that bad, but so Rimbaud though might have been his ticket. I often think about that. His dedication to the French poets in general, that might have been Jim Morrison's ticket into Poets' Corner in that cemetery in Paris. But hang on to your thought on whether or not this is true, where there's any other thing that backs up this claim that Jim Morrison traded in artifacts and worked after his supposed death. Coming up tomorrow night on Coast to Coast AM, I am going to hack your brain. I'm going to tell you right now, those of you who are falling asleep listening, listen tomorrow night. Listen tomorrow night. The show's all about brain hacking with Dr. Bart Costco. It'll be great. And first hour, Peter Lance with an update on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. The Doors and Jim Morrison were talking about the kind of the untied up threads in his life, especially regarding his departure and the possibility that he might have faked his death and moved to Africa. I know it sounds like something which is almost now trite. Yeah, they faked his death and moved to Africa. But there was some interesting testimony about it, and that's what we're looking back on 50 years after his supposed death in Paris. But that song, Riders on the Storm, is probably very real right now for many people across the country. There is a huge... I mean, my alerts are going off on my phone. I don't know about you. For severe weather ahead, it's moving up through the Midwest and heading east. Like the East hasn't gotten enough of that lately. And hopefully it'll dissipate and all will be fine, but it has the potential of creating tornadoes in various communities. So be mindful of that. And even as we speak, even as we were playing there with little sound effects of a thunderstorm rumbling in the distance, I have a real one outside of where I sit in the middle of Kansas right now. And I don't know if you can even hear it over the microphone. But about every 5 seconds, all the windows light up, and I can see outside as though it's noon. The storm is heading right over my head, and wherever you are, be safe. But keep on listening, because the show's just getting started, including open lines, which we'll get to next hour on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. It's Coast to Coast AM, and we're talking with Michael Christopher, rock writer. I mentioned at the very beginning of the show my friend Dennis Carlin, who's the nephew of George, who has been sharing his thoughts with me on Twitter at Deacon Punnett. We kind of DM back and forth a little bit on this subject, and I'm glad to see that he's on a first-time caller line. We'll get to him in just a second. But the subject of Arthur Rimbaud came up, the French author, who is not, by the way, buried in Poets' Corner, but at the Père Lachaise Cemetery, the largest necropolis in the world, one of the most visited cemeteries in the world. There are many others, including Jim Morrison. And so do you want to talk a little bit about that, about what informs the death of Jim Morrison based on his idols and his love of French literature?
I think that one of the big things about Jim Morrison's celebrity was how much he hated it because of the fact that it was tied to him being a singer and not a poet. Multiple times he would say, I never want to sing Light My Fire again. That's not representative of who I am. That's a pop song that I didn't even write, and people identify it with me. And I think he really wanted to be viewed as more of a poet. Rimbaud was definitely his main influence, which is why he wanted to spend so much time getting inspiration in Paris. He fell in love with the city when he played there with the Doors in the late 60s. And Rimbaud did have that really interesting life where he had completed all of his works at a young age and then for all intents and purposes disappeared to Africa, where he was a trader. He was one of the first white traders in spices, and in this region that he went to in Ethiopia. And there was even rumors that he was doing some sort of gun running there, which Jim thought was what an adventurous life to be a poet and to go and get involved in trading in Africa. Even at the end of one of their songs, Wild Child, which I mentioned earlier, the cover by the Cult, Jim intones "Remember When We Were in Africa," just out of nowhere, and people never understood what that was about, whether it was where people first originated or if it was something a little bit more off the path that we might not think of. But yeah, he did have the influence of all those amazing poets that traveled to Paris for their inspiration, and he wanted to get a little bit of that himself. Whether he followed Rimbaud to Africa or followed in his footsteps to Africa, that's one of those mysteries that surrounds his death.
You know, that's compelling, and I would add to that Jim Morrison was not afraid of guns either. I say that only, but I thought it was true. I read somewhere that Pam Corson, his common law wife, collected guns. I thought that just doesn't.
Right.
I can't quite reconcile with what.
It's a little dangerous. You know, you'll fight with your significant other, and she's a gun collector. And I don't know if I want that.
And particularly like German Lugers or something. She had some fetish for. Sure, I don't know. I probably got that wrong, but it cracks me up anyway. All right, so let's get back to the phones. Hanging on is my friend Dennis on the first-time caller line on Coast to Coast AM. Because Dennis, long-time listener, but you are a first-time caller.
Correct. Yeah, actually, I'm a 100-time caller, first time getting through calling. But I'm
good
west
to have you,
of
buddy.
Rockies, and I'm also west of the Santa Monica Mountains. I've had 2 Super Beats, 1 Carnivora, and there's 3 girls from Paranormal Date here.
Well, you are the perfect advertisement for everything great about Coast to Coast. So thank you.
I'm not in Mel's hole, though. No.
I hope you're feeling great. I hope you're.
I'm so excited, and this is a subject that's really close to me because I was going to talk about the poet, but I'm going to talk about what I said I wasn't going to talk about. In the late 70s, and I wasn't a huge Doors fan at that time in junior high,
right?
Because Jim Morrison and the Doors sounded really not like the Ramones or Cheap Trick,
right?
And so the stoner kids in my 8th grade school they would come back and go, "We just saw Jim Morrison get out of a car and go into this house, dude. We just saw Jim Morrison get out of a car."
Right.
They weren't like making a joke, or I don't think anyone was even in on like he faked his death or any of that. And I was like, that's weird. Like, why would you say that? And then years later, I found out that his sister Ann lived down the street from my junior high school. And I was like, oh, wow, that adds up to that sighting. And so it's a neat subject. Much respect to the Morrison family, to Robbie and John, because you're talking about possibly, whether he died or didn't die, it's their friend and their family. So
right.
I just wanted to say that too. And also that George Carlin faked his death, and he's sitting right next to
Uncle George is right there. Dennis, and Michael, you might even, let me tell you, so Dennis follows this subject very closely. So you might even have questions, Michael, for Dennis, because Dennis is on all of this. But I will say, interestingly enough, from what you had already thrown out there, that celebrity is what it is, and you are often in a position online where you're kind of, quote unquote, sort of defending your Uncle George for comments that he didn't make, or people that take a comment out of context. And I've respected you for doing that. So as your cousin does that too.
Yeah.
But I think you mentioned, let's mention John Densmore. He was the guy who fought very hard legally to keep the Doors music from getting pimped out for TV commercials.
Yeah, that's great. I think they're one of the surviving bands of that integrity, and it was because of John. That's great. But he was mad at Ray when Ray was like, "That's not Jim wouldn't fit in that box," and I don't think that and he got really mad at Ray from what I've read.
For insinuating that he wasn't buried there in the cemetery?
That's one of the reasons why I questioned it. Ray Manzarek questions it. This is like, it's not like some guy like, oh, Elvis,
Right.
Elvis at a truck stop. It's like, this is a guy who was in the band with the guy who was at the funeral and saw it and said, you know, Jim's 6'2", that box is 5'8". That doesn't add up. I hope he faked his death, and I hope he escaped and had a happy life. I really, because I don't
Right.
think he was happy where he was with the fame and what that brought. So I hope that he got that, and he got exactly what he wanted. We're talking about Jim Morrison all night on the radio,
Right.
whether he died there or didn't, and you know that's the mystery, and that's cool. And
That's fair enough. Well, let me get Michael Christopher in here. Don't go anywhere, Dennis.
Sure.
Michael, where are you with all this?
Yeah, you know, I think it caused a lot of friction over the years between Ray Manzarek and John Densmore because I had mentioned this before. Ray was always kind of fanning those flames that maybe Jim's alive. We don't know. And John's like, just let it go. We've been to the grave. He's gone. And I don't think that Ray did it maliciously. I think that he was more of a, you know, almost that hippie way of the 60s and, well, maybe this could happen and maybe that. And I really believe in, not conspiracies, but just that something else could have gone down. But I think that John Densmore was more of a realist. And then they had more friction over the years when Ray decided to get the band back together in the late 90s and early 2000s. And John said, I don't want you going out there as the Doors. It's not the Doors without Jim. We tried it without Jim after he died, and it didn't work. What makes you think it's going to work now?
Right.
They got into a bunch of lawsuits, and I did hear that they were friendly before Ray died a couple years ago, and hopefully that's the case.
Well, they played the rock and roll.
You know, that's like every rock band from the 60s, like ELO, the Beach Boys, and you know.
Well, but I think what's interesting is Densmore had a veto power, which is what they had established, that everybody had to agree equally on whatever. And Densmore fought to keep that veto power and won until there really weren't any more lawsuits. I don't think there's anything pending anymore. But Dennis, always a pleasure. We'll chat soon. DM me anytime,
can I
buddy.
tell you one unreleased George Carlin joke that does involve a Doors song?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, so when you'd go over to their house for Thanksgiving, George would always work out new stuff on me and my dad. So yeah, I'm going to tell you this one. So he goes, you know Muzak? He goes, you know how Muzak always has that part where they get rock out and they get really excited? He goes, I always picture the old guys in the studio like playing Light My Fire, going I thought it was funny.
It is funny, and I can imagine him doing that. And that is exactly how it sounds. Like they think they're really going crazy, and it still sounds like Muzak to the rest of us. All right, great. Have a great night, Dennis. And we'll get a couple more people who are ready and been waiting. Thank you so much. We'll go to David, who's in Columbus on Coast to Coast AM. David?
And your guess, I'm 68 years old. I saw the Doors and Steppenwolf at the old Agora in Columbus.
Oh, cool.
And that was a show and a half. Morrison came out, and he just electrified the audience.
I bet.
And I still remember this day because I went to a lot of concerts in the late 60s, early 70s, and that one always stood out to me. And they closed with the song Unknown Soldier. And I can remember that well. And I don't think Steppenwolf liked the idea of warming up for the Doors. But it was a very interesting show, and I got a question for your guests. I heard after Jim Morrison died, the surviving members tried to get Paul Rodgers to be their lead singer from Free because they thought he would come close to doing what Morrison did. And is there any truth to that rumor? And the other one is, on the Ed Sullivan Show, they tried to tell Morrison not to use the word high, and Ed said he would never put them on the show again. And I'll hang up and listen to your answers.
Yeah, that's a very famous story. So Girl, You Can't Get Much Higher, and the producer, pushed on by Ed Sullivan himself, asked, it was replace higher with better. Is that the line that they want?
Better, girl. We couldn't get much better.
And instead, Morrison leans right into the camera and yells higher, right on CBS in defiance. But that first part was interesting. Do you want to go with that?
As far as the Paul Rogers?
Yeah, I had never heard that. Paul Rogers goes on along with, I think, the drummer from Free to form Bad Company.
Bad Company, yeah. You know,
Right.
it's interesting because Paul Rogers didn't even find out about that until years later. When there was no auditions for a new singer for the Doors, but the Doors were thinking, who could we get to sing in Jim's place? So they were fans of Free, the members of the Doors, and they said, well, why don't we get that Paul Rogers guy? And at one point they were even in England, and they couldn't even locate him. For whatever reason, they couldn't get a hold of him, and they thought, maybe that's a sign, and we'll just continue as a trio. But at one point, and I think he might have been the only one that they considered at the time to replace Jim Morrison, but they just couldn't get in touch with him and said, well, maybe that's a sign.
I think it was actually good. There's a knock on Paul Rogers. I don't know if it's true, but the people that I knew who were in it, kind of in that circle, that rock circle, that he always sings the same song exactly the same way. He was not a big improv guy, and that I don't know that would have fit with the rest of the band. I don't know if that's true or fair, but that's something I'd always heard.
I think that they were a lot different as frontmen. I mean, you can't compare the way the Bad Company was with the way the Doors were. They were so improvisational. They had that background in jazz.
Right.
And they were more of a free-form kind of rock and roll band that I don't think that Paul Rogers would have been a good fit for that at all.
Charlene is in California on Coast to Coast. Charlene?
Hello, how's it going?
Hey. Good. You?
Not bad. I have a couple of questions. One for you, Ian, and one for your guest.
Okay.
Which would you like first?
Well, let's go me just to get it out of the way real quick.
Okay. It's just a real quick question about the pronunciation of Deus Stema. Is that how you say it at the end of the show when you close with that?
I don't close with that. You mean when George does?
No, you. When you say Deus Stema.
Oh, no, you're saying, Deus Tiamat. I understand what you're saying. Now I understand.
Pronunciation, yeah.
Yeah, Deus, Latin for God, te, meaning you, amat, love.
Oh, okay, because I'm hearing impaired, and I was always trying to figure out the exact
I totally get that.
I could not... especially the ending of the letters. Like, I couldn't tell if it was M-A or N-A, or I'm like, and I really love the sound of that word.
Well, I appreciate that. Here, I'll give you a quick little thing, and then we'll get to your question. So, Deus te amat, there's lots of different ways to say God loves you in Latin. That's the one I choose, but you can conjugate it in a couple different ways, different declensions. I was forbidden once by a program director to ever say God loves you at the end of my show. And so I started saying it in Latin because he didn't understand Latin. And then it just stuck. So there you go. Question for Michael Christopher.
Yes, I just had a quick question about Jim Morrison's parents. Now, did they find out right away about his death, or did they find out later like everybody else did? And did they ever have a public reaction to his death and where he was buried there? I mean, did they object to his being buried there?
They didn't find out when everybody else did. They did find out days later, though. I think they were alerted a little bit before the statement was made by the manager of the Doors that their son had died. They thought that was, even though they were going to find out days after he had passed, the least that they could do was let them know before it became public knowledge. As far as what they had said in passing, after that, they didn't want his body exhumed and brought back to Florida. They thought that he wanted to be buried there in Paris, that they were going to honor his wishes. And they were very, of course, upset you're losing a child, that their son has passed. And the way that they found out was not a good way either, that they find out a couple days later after his passing. But yeah, I couldn't even imagine finding out days later that your son has passed away.
Grab Pete and Charlotte real quickly, and then we'll have to make this fast, Pete, to get you in before the top of the hour.
Yeah, I want to ask Michael, there's a famous photograph of a Bo Diddley concert where he's leaning over, screaming at the guy on the stage, and the guy about 2 feet away from him screaming right back is Jim Morrison. Have you seen the photograph?
I've seen that photograph, yeah.
Pete, did we lose him? It sounded like he was... in a storm anyway, and I am too right now, which is funny. So I'm getting a lot of static on my line, and I imagine it's because of the storm that's overhead. And I'm also partially hard of hearing. Well, I am hard of hearing. So that was why I didn't really hear Charlene's question for a while. I thought she was talking about at the end of when George does the show, he has this long list of names of people that he thanks. And I thought she was talking about Dave, somebody. So pardon me for my dunce moment there. And Michael Christopher, thank you. Love this. I hope this was everything that you hoped it would be.
Ian, always a pleasure talking with you. I love
Did you know freedom exists in a school book? Did you know madmen are running our prison within a jail, within a gale, within a white free Protestant maelstrom? We're perched headlong in the edge of boredom. We're reaching for death on the end of a candle. We're trying for something that's already found us. Wow, I'm sick of doubt. Live in the light of certain South cruel bindings. The servants have the power. Dog men and their mean women pulling poor blankets over our sailors. I'm sick of dour faces staring at me from the TV tower. I want roses in my garden bower, dig? Royal babies, rubies must now replace aborted strangers in the mud. These mutants, blood meal for the plant that's plowed. They are waiting to take us into the severed garden. You know how pale and wanton thrillful comes death in a strange hour, unannounced, unplanned for, like a scaring, over-friendly guest you've brought to bed. Death makes angels of us all and gives us wings where we had shoulders smooth as ravens' claws. No more money, no more fancy dress. This other kingdom seems by far the best, until its other jaw reveals incest and loose obedience to a vegetable law. I will not go. Prefer a feast of friends to the giant family.